Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to introduce the final panel. There's a certain symmetry. I began introducing last night's panel, so I will introduce the last. It's been a very interesting, a rich day, a lot to think about. Obviously, we all have to digest what we heard, but hopefully this will just be the beginning of a serious and sustained conversation. And also, it's been evident from the people who've spoken from the floor and the people I've met in the tea room that we have attracted a very, very talented audience, a very wide audience, a very important audience, and we hope that we'll be able to include all of us in this ongoing conversation. So thank you very much for coming. Our first speaker in the final session is Mr. Stephane Jaquemet. He is the Regional Representative for Southern Europe of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. He began this appointment in April 2016. He has been working with the UNHCR for 24 years. He's really a veteran. He was the head of operations in Croatia. He continued his career in Togo, and he was also a senior officer from 1997 to 2002 in a number of important international destinations. He has worked in Lebanon, he's worked in Burkina Faso, he's worked in Colombia, so he's a man of very considerable experience, including Nepal. He is a Swiss national, studied law at Lausanne University, and was called to the Swiss bar in 1981. He then successfully completed his MA, his master's degree in criminology at the University of Paris, so he's certainly well qualified to take on the subject of our conference, and I ask him to come to the podium.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the vote of confidence. I will try to be up to the expectations.
I'm sure you will.
Both as a UNHCR official and personally, I feel at the same time humbled and very proud to address this conference. Thank you to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance and the Holy See for inviting me, but above all for choosing such a relevant and topical theme. I unfortunately have no doubt that we find ourselves at a very perilous crossroad where anti-Semitism, racism, hatred, disregard for the most basic human decency are on the rise. At a perilous crossroad where extreme right-wing parties and movements, sometimes with the tacit or explicit acquiescence of more mainstream political parties, which is the most worrying part, are unfortunately, with some success, rewriting history and challenging our human rights culture. At a perilous crossroad where entire regions are plagued by conflicts, war crimes, and cleansing of civilian populations. Finally, a perilous crossroad where we have the largest number of refugees and internally displaced persons since World War II, some of them finding open doors and policies, fortunately, others closed doors and closed hearts. To understand today's and tomorrow's challenges and responsibility, it is essential not only to have an historical perspective, but also to remember. Because it is only through remembering that we can build the antidote against hatred, rejection, and discrimination. And this is the first essential message given to us by the Holocaust survivors. I quote, "We cannot understand, but we can and must understand from where it springs, and we must be on our guard because what happened can happen again. For this reason, it is everyone's duty to reflect on what happened. Primo Levi. The second message, and I have 5, is that the Holocaust was not an accident of history. It was not a sudden cataclysm. As the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres reminded us on 27 January 2017 during the observance of the International Day of Commemoration in memory of the victims of Holocaust, it would be a dangerous error to think of the Holocaust as simply the result of the insanity of a group of criminal Nazis. On the contrary, the Holocaust was the culmination of millennia of hatred and discrimination targeting the Jews, what we now call anti-Semitism. The third message, very much linked to the second one, is that between 1933 and 1945, there were hardcore criminals operating, but above all, the complicity of those who remained silent. Indifference, because it paves the way for the most brutal instincts to flourish, is a killer. During that period, indifference took many forms, including socially accepted anti-Semitism, which made the Holocaust possible. I quote, "I swore never to be silent whenever and wherever human beings endure suffering and humiliation. We must take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented." Elie Wiesel. The fourth message is, or rather, it is not a message, it's a fact, and a horrible one. Jews were not only the victims of an extermination campaign, but they found, for the vast majority of them, closed borders when they tried to flee. And those closing the borders knew, or should have known, that closed borders meant extermination. So the Holocaust was also characterized by the international unwillingness and complete failure to protect. The last message I would like to share with you is that all survivors of the Shoah and their descendants have spoken up against all forms of discrimination and hatred, and in support of all the victims of that hatred. Precisely because they had survived systematic annihilation and the most horrible form of suffering, they stood up and keep standing up as soon as discrimination and hatred has been detected, because they know that discrimination and hatred is the beginning of a dangerous and slippery road where at each additional curve brings additional suffering. An example among thousands of others of solidarity from Holocaust survivors and their descendants with solidarity with refugees comes from Milan's Holocaust Memorial. Since we are in Italy, I took the example of Milan. In 2015, the memorial started offering temporary shelter to migrants and refugees stranded at Milan's central station. Indifference is the word engraved on the wall at the entrance of the memorial, and as Roger Cohen puts it in his 8 October 2015 article in the New York Times, and I quote him, "So it was perhaps inevitable that when Roberto Jarash, the vice president of the memorial, was asked if he could help with Milan's refugee crisis, he saw that word flash through his mind. As hundreds of desperate refugees converge daily on Milan's central station, opened during the rule of the fascist dictator Benito Mussolini, the memorial could not show indifference. And still quoting Roger Cohen, there is no direct analogy between the situation of millions of refugees today and the Jews who were deported from Milan's Platform 21, as the memorial is also known. The refugees are fleeing war, not in general targeted annihilation. Still, there are echoes, not least in that word, indifference. Nobody saw the Jews, nobody wanted to see them. Indifference kills, as Syria demonstrates. The current refugee crisis, and I'm using the plural, we cannot listen whether it's singular or plural, but it's plural because we have more today than 10 refugee crises. And when I use the word crisis, it means emergency, very large number, and not the, sorry for the expression, ordinary refugee situation that we have in many countries. We have 10 proper crises in parallel at the moment. It's almost unprecedented, that number. That needs more than a humanitarian response. The latter is necessary but not sufficient. We above all need to be vigilant. We need to proactively fight against, and sorry for the expression, the mildest forms of discrimination and any expression of hatred, because they may appear mild today, but they will be the seed for tomorrow's atrocities. We all, as individuals or associations, must show daily solidarity, basic, simple human solidarity with refugees. And we have to counteract with all our strength and intelligence the narrative of those revisiting history, challenging the human rights system and culture built during the last 17 years, and portraying refugees as profiteers or as a threat to national identity. This narrative is highly toxic, and we have to collectively ensure that as persons, society, and community of states, we refuse to be intoxicated. I'm glad that this conference has put us on this path of solidarity and fighting indifference, which may well be the most essential contribution to refugee contribution. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very well constructed talk. Our last speaker is Professor Michael O'Flaherty. Professor O'Flaherty has been the director of the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights since 2015. Previously, he was professor of human rights and director of the Irish Centre for Human Rights at the National University of Ireland in Galway. He has served as Chief Commissioner of the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission. In addition, he has held a number of senior United Nations positions in the field, supported by the UN headquarters in various human rights programs. He has been the Vice Chairman of the UN Human Rights Committee, and he has sat on the advisory boards of numerous human rights groups and international journals. His recent publications include publications on violence and the law, the practice of human rights, the professionalization of human rights fieldwork, and human rights diplomacy. So he's eminently qualified to be our final speaker in this conference. Professor Flaherty.
Professor Katz, thank you very much indeed for the very warm introduction, and I'm so grateful to the organisers for the invitation to be here with you today. I'm in the pretty horrible position of being the last person to speak after, frankly, just about everything has been said. But being Irish, that's not going to stop me. I want to, in the first place, to join my voice to those who say what a relevant event this is. It's not just relevant because of the imminence and the existence and the scale of the crisis. It's relevant because of the really smart idea to learn from the past, and in particular the horror of the Holocaust, with a view to learning for the present. And it's evident that we've learned a lot today. I'm also struck by the venue. I think this building is a very correct and proper place to hold a discussion such as ours. It is today the representation of justice within the Catholic Church. All of its great courts are located in this building. And I think it's good to remember that justice is at the essence of what we're seeking to deliver in these conversations. The history of this building is no less relevant. This, at various times, has been the residence of Queen Christina of Sweden and of the Cardinal Duke of York. And for those of you who know your European history, you'll recall that the dislocations of those two royal personalities represented major, important, disruptive displacements in European history. And so again, I think not bad to have our discussions in that context. As an agency, the Fundamental Rights Agency is particularly appreciative of being invited because of the extent to which we are engaged across all the dimensions of today's conversations. Arguably, responding to the migration crisis is our top issue these days. We've had teams present in the reception centres, the hotspots in Greece and Italy for all of the last year. Every month, we're publishing a public analysis on the situation as it rolls out in 14 EU member states, and we have delivered numerous opinions to the EU legislator on how to make the revision of asylum-related law human rights compliant. And that's just the tip of the iceberg of what we're doing right now. We have also, for a much longer period, been engaged around issues of remembering the Holocaust, so that we can learn from it today, so that we can build up respectful societies in Europe, whereby such an act and such a set of atrocities can never again be seen. And it's in that context that we so deeply appreciate our increasingly close partnership with IHRA, an organisation with which we hold much in common. And may I say also, in terms of the other of our hosts, the Holy See, we very much want to deepen our relationship as an EU agency with the faith communities. We need to repopulate the very large common ground that we share in the pursuit of the protection and promotion of human rights. Now, what have I taken away from today? I have, and trust me, they really are short, because you'll be appalled when I give you the figure. I have 10 plus 1 takeaways. And rather than repeat much of what we've learned, I'm going to just briefly give you my 10 plus 1 takeaways. The first of those is to learn. It is imperative that we, as people who contribute to the making of policy, that we assiduously learn from the past. I learned 2 things today. I was reminded, rather, of the extent to which we need to relearn how you manage a refugee centre, a refugee facility, not least through the participation of the residents in the decisions about how their facility is managed and operated. I learned from history today of how you have to be very careful where you house migrants and refugees in reception facilities, how you can re-traumatize them by putting them carelessly in the wrong community setting. That's immediately relevant today. I think, for example, of the complaints we've received from facilities on the frontiers of Europe of people who fled their home countries because they're gay, and they've been relocated into camps which have exactly the same population makeup of the places from which they fled. It's a transfer of the same lesson. So learning from the past to inform the future. Second takeaway, to listen better. I took both of these, frankly, from Mukesh's memorable contribution, but they're spoken of more widely. The first is that we in Europe have to get humble, and we have to recognize the extent to which other parts of the world have done this stuff very well, and we can learn from them as we respond. When I first went to the Greek islands about 14 months ago, I was very struck, as somebody with a background in the UN in the Global South, of the extent to which stuff was not working that would automatically work if the facilities were somewhere in sub-Saharan Africa, let's say. And so we in Europe have to recognise that it is being done elsewhere better, and we can do a better job ourselves through that active listening. And secondly, listening is not just about listening to experiences from elsewhere, it's about listening to migrants themselves. We don't do enough of that. I intend absolutely no criticism for the organisers of our conference, but I would like to have heard more the direct voice of those who have journeyed to our shores in recent years. They could have something very powerful to tell us in our discourse today. The third of my takeaways is to see. To do a better job of seeing what the reality is out there in order to respond to it. And from the particular point of view of my agency, the seeing that I have in mind has to do with the particular vulnerabilities of those we are receiving into our European lands. I think of the extent to which we are inadequately seeing children. We are seeing people, and we somehow think that the solutions for people will be adequate to the needs of children, and that's simply not the case. And one of the defining concerns of the past year has been a persistent inability to deliver adequate, targeted child protection responses. Another aspect of not adequately seeing that we're looking at right now is in the context of a report we'll publish next week on how we treat torture victims who arrive on our shores. And I can tell you, our report next week will tell us that, for example, there is only one EU member state that is systematically recording the incidence of torture victims in their first reception facilities. And that country is Greece. Greece, which is so often maligned, is generating good practice in this and other matters. And by the way, it's not for discussion this afternoon, but the incidence of torture victims among the registered asylum seekers in Greece is 1%. That may not sound high, but if you roll that out, that comes to tens of thousands of people across Europe, if that's an accurate figure from which we can extrapolate. So they're just two examples of where we need to do a better job of seeing the specificities of the experience of those who arrive so that we can respond appropriately. My next takeaway is simply the word facts. We perhaps can do a much better job of generating and then using the evidence base for the responses to the situation. This is a very large part of what the Fundamental Rights Agency is committed to, generating the evidence base so that the policymakers can deal with the actual realities. But in the particular context of the migration crisis, for example, I'm struck by the extent to which we allow a narrative that these migrants are mainly economic migrants to take a dominant place. And yet, the fact is that, for example, in 2015, 3/5 of the migrants who arrived in Europe in the context of the crisis came from the top 10 refugee-producing states in the world: Eritrea, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya. And so this already confounds the notion that we are dealing predominantly with an issue of economic migrants. Another issue of facts, or rather of myths that have to be dispelled by fact, is the issue of where sexual violence comes from in Europe. You may recall that there was a very mischievous narrative run in some parts of the media in January of last year following the undoubted, because they happened, Cologne sexual attacks, where young migrant men attacked women during the New Year's celebrations in Cologne. Nobody's denying it happened, but it was a narrative that was spun from that somehow migrants were bringing sexual violence to Europe, and that was the nonsense, that was the myth. We have serious problems of sexual violence in Europe, but they're indigenous, they're long-standing in our societies. And so when we see these myths, when we know that the fact is not as represented, we must challenge. The fifth of my takeaways is the word frame. It is very important to adequately and properly frame our presentation, our understanding, our engagement with the migration crisis. In the first place, I welcome the extent to which we discussed today the importance of framing the situation as a matter of international law. We did not build up the international legal and human rights system after the Second World War to ignore it in a crisis the scale of which we're seeing today. And I don't want to say a lot more about that. It received more than adequate attention this afternoon. I would just add that there is one little known but very significant international legal instrument directly relevant to the crisis, and that is the European Union Charter of Fundamental Rights. It's the only international treaty in the human rights field with an explicit guarantee of asylum. It contains a guarantee of non-refoulement, and it contains a number of other guarantees directly related, creating binding legal obligations with regard to the migration situation, but I don't see it sufficiently reflected in the discourse. A second element of framing that's imperative is that we do a better job of framing the crisis in terms of values. Now, I raised this point deliberately this afternoon to make clear what I mean by values, because I'm not interested in this notion of European values. It's a mischievous, it's a dangerous concept. It's a concept that divides, that subordinates, that creates a hierarchy of values based on geography. That's extremely dangerous. I would much rather talk of a framework of the universal values, the shared universal values, but those universal values which we as Europeans hold dear. In that way I can talk about values, because I'm talking about a shared value with my Libyan or my Syrian brother or sister, not imposing my set on them. In the context of values, just one value which needs to be given content in Europe is that of solidarity. We speak glibly of solidarity being a European value. I attended a meeting of Justice and Interior Ministers a couple of weeks ago where there was negotiation underway on what will be called the solidarity mechanism. It's a device whereby when the pressure of migration on a particular member state reaches a certain level, the mechanism kicks in to redistribute these people across the European Union. The solidarity mechanism. But it was being discussed without any ethical content, purely as a mechanistic tool. And I think we have to do some hard work on that. And I'd plead to ethicists and philosophers in particular in this room to pay attention here. The sixth of my framing words is that of context. There were some great reminders of the context of the responses to the crisis in the room this morning and this afternoon. And I just refer to two. The first had to do with the economy and with the shocking levels of inequality in European society and the extent to which those levels of inequality are contributing to a lack of welcome, to a feeding of the populism that received so much discussion. We have an opportunity to do something meaningful about inequality right now in European policy making through the very remarkably rapid development of something called the European Social Pillar. I'm sure many of you have not heard of it, but it is a device that is emerging inside the bureaucracy of the European Union, which I think could make a meaningful contribution to the Union prioritizing inequality as an unacceptable aspect of Europe that must be tackled in a very vigorous way. And I welcome the important statement made by Jaquemet on the European Social Pillar just a few days ago. Jaquemet, as many will know, is the consortium of Christian aid organizations in the European space. The second and last of the issues of context I'll mention is that of rule of law. Perhaps it wasn't adequately flagged today, but we face problems of the stability. We're no longer so confident of the solidity of the rule of law frameworks for our societies, our states within the European Union. We have seen too many challenges to the independence of the judiciary, to a thriving free media, to a respectful place for the role of parliaments. And we must wake up to the seriousness of these threats and their implications for a proper response for migration, but much more widely. The seventh of my takeaways is the word shame. I I could engage the word shame from many points of view. It wasn't my intention, but it occurs to me now. I could engage the word shame to be reflected back to all of us. Shame on us as societies for our lack of generosity. But what I actually mean is, let us shame those who commit illegalities. As I said, this can be framed as a matter of law, and therefore we can point to illegalities. It can be framed as a matter of values, and so let us shame the immoralities where we see them. And by the way, in terms of illegalities and immoralities, let's see a lot more prosecution of hate speech and hate crime, including in the context of the migration crisis. I mentioned that my agency is monitoring the situation in 14 member states on an ongoing basis, reporting publicly every month. I thought to read out to you a page from our upcoming report. I don't have time. It would be a tedious way to give you the information. But suffice to say that across every one of the 14 countries, the monthly repeated incidents of swastikas on buildings, of spitting on people on streets, of intolerable action, even the destruction of places of worship is really very shocking indeed. The eighth of my 10+1 takeaways is the word sell. It's not just good enough for us to have the right solutions, to have the clever responses, to dream up the appropriate policies. We have to do a much better job of selling them, of engaging the people who can make a difference, of convincing them. Just a couple of points here. One is, and I didn't hear this term used today, we need to do a better job of making the business case for the reception of migrants. It does make for better societies. It makes for healthier societies. It makes for more prosperous societies. Einstein was a refugee. I could go on forever with my list. We strengthen who we are as communities, also through the diversity that's engendered through the receipt of those arriving at our frontiers. And then the last point of sell that I take away from today is to do a much better job of communicating. It's come up time and time again today. It's been clarified as a concern in January and February of 2017 as I've never seen it before. For the first time, I find we're all saying that we don't know how to communicate anymore. And we have to stop saying that, and we have to get around the business of figuring out how to communicate. And that's an important issue for the coming year. The ninth, about which I'll say very little, is mobilize. We're not mobilized sufficiently. And if I may respectfully suggest in this hallowed chamber that faith communities need to be more active, more visible, more vocal, not just in speaking truth to power in terms of the decision makers, but in speaking to societies and communities so that the peoples of Europe come to appreciate what's at stake. And then the final, the 10th of my 10+1 is persist. I have in mind here two dimensions of the need for persistence in this crisis. The first is that it's hard work. It's going to take time to get the change. It's not going to happen overnight. We must be patient and we must be tenacious. But the second element of persistence that I think we must keep in mind is that reception of migrants must involve long-term approaches, which include not only respectful reception at the frontier, but everything through to the intergenerational integration in society. And again, this perhaps needs more attention. It isn't about a homogenized integration approach, but rather a diversity of approaches that respect certain core values and legal obligations. And to shamelessly advertise, we at the Fundamental Rights Agency will publish a major report in coming weeks on exactly this issue. Now, I said that I had 10+1 takeaways, and my final takeaway, I don't know, is it a takeaway or a give to? It's hope. I think it's imperative that we don't lose hope. I have hope. I am optimistic. It's not entirely naive, my hope. I think it's reasonably well placed. My hope is based, for example, on the remarkable good practices that I see across Europe. Guardianship of children was not working in many places in 2015. In 2017, it is. Children were locked in cages in some places at the hotspots in Greece at the end of 2015. Most of them are not in those cages anymore. I could give you countless examples of where people are tackling the problems and coming up with something that actually does work to alleviate the suffering and the human rights abuse. The second reason that I'm hopeful is because of the fundamental goodwill that I see everywhere. I have yet to meet a single human being who wants to do harm to those in his or her care, in terms of those who are managing reception facilities and those who are shaping policy. Not once have I found a will to hurt. I found confusion, I found a lack of expertise, I found a sense of being overwhelmed by the enormity of it all, but I found goodwill. And it's not just among those bureaucrats that were described sometimes dismissively today, but also on streets. And I would simply recall to you the generosity of the women of Lesbos in terms of how they received people back when that island was overwhelmed just over a year ago. And then the third and the final, and I'll finish with this, the final basis for my hope that we'll find a solution here is the existence of the human rights system. This astonishing achievement since the Second World War. This thing that means that qualitatively we can never ever simply say we're back in the 1930s or the 1940s. I'm one of those who believes that the human rights system we've achieved is resilient, will survive, and will give us the answers we need. And I'm very pleased to say that I'm in the excellent company of Pope St. John Paul II when I make that claim. I reread the speech he gave to the United Nations General Assembly in September 1979 when he made 22 references to human rights, and among which he described human rights as mankind's crowning achievement in the modern era. And I think that achievement is what will eventually show us the way out of our current mess. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Professor Flaherty. Our last two speakers have done great honor to the conference. I have the last word, though I'm always worried about that. My wife says I should have the last word. Yes, dear. So I am a little cautious, but I want to take this opportunity to thank everyone again who made this possible. First of all the people in the Vatican who've been so cooperative and helpful, starting with His Holiness Pope Francis. We thank Archbishop Tomasi and Archbishop Gallagher for their presence last night, very distinguished senior members of the church, other people who've helped in the Secretary of State office, Father Hoffman, Monsignor Parolin, and so on. I'd also like to thank all of my IHRA colleagues. A lot of them were on display today. You saw how talented and clever and erudite they are, and they're a pleasure to work with. Also, the leadership of IHRA, Ambassador Constantinescu, who unfortunately is near the end of the Romanian chair, and Dr. Catherine Meyer, our Executive Secretary. Also, a thank you to all of our wonderful speakers from all over. I should tell you that we're planning a publication. Obviously, today was only a kind of small example. We're going to ask for full papers with all the documentation so people will have a real chance to express themselves. We hope to do that expeditiously and to get that book out during 2017. Also, I'd like to thank everyone here. As I said before, it's been a wonderful and very special audience, and so I thank you for your presence, and I hope we'll stay in touch. Thank you.